A repair bench in Manchester or Minneapolis. Laptop on the table, screen uncracked. Battery holding charge. Every key clicking back. The technician has already run the diagnostic. One chip, smaller than a grain of cooked rice, soldered flat against the motherboard with no socket and no handle, has failed. The chip costs roughly $2 to manufacture. The repair quote comes back at $400. That is not a story about greed, it is a story about architecture, and the architecture was shaped in Beijing before it ever reached your device. The wall built to slow China's low-end chip industry did not slow it. The wall became the blueprint, and the eviction of your device from the world of repairability was already written into that design. Here's what this covers. How a price restriction compressed an entire chip sector into a form that is structurally impossible to service. Why the right to repair movement has no jurisdiction over the outcome. And why the most consequential chip in your laptop was never the one on the box. China's low-cost embedded controller sector now supplies a large and growing share of the small chips managing everyday consumer electronics. Laptops, tablets, smart home devices. These chips handle power sequencing, battery management, keyboard control, and in some designs, the firmware verification that runs before your operating system even loads. They are typically soldered directly to the motherboard in package formats, with pad spacings too fine to feel with a fingertip. The tool needed to lift one without destroying the board underneath costs more than most of the devices it would be used to fix. Think of the chip as a load-bearing bolt welded into a wall. The bolt itself is cheap. The wall it is inside is not. That is the surface of the story. But the chip's size is not the real constraint. Its function is. When power management, firmware storage, and security verification are co-integrated in a single chip, a failure in any one of those functions typically renders the whole device unbootable. Some manufacturers implement cryptographic pairing between that chip and the main processor, meaning a replacement part, even an identical one with the same model number, will not authenticate without a factory-level flashing procedure that independent repair shops cannot access. One tenant on the ground floor stops paying rent. The lease was written so that a single default dissolves every contract in the building. Everyone leaves. That is what chip-level integration does to a repair diagnosis. A $2 component failure triggers a board-level replacement priced in the hundreds, or the device gets written off entirely. Now the tariff enters the room, and this is where the story stops being only about repairability. United States export restrictions have denied Chinese chip designers access to the most advanced fabrication processes, effectively capping them at process generations that were leading edge roughly a decade ago by Western standards. At those older processes, achieving competitive performance per dollar requires aggressive functional integration. You put more logic on one die rather than distributing it across multiple specialized chips. You cannot build wide, so you build tall. The restriction on square footage does not stop construction. It changes the architecture. Tariffs applied to Chinese electronics components across multiple rounds since roughly 2018 raised the landed cost of these chips in certain markets. Reports suggest they did not reduce design wins. They accelerated the move toward higher integration parts that justified their price through function consolidation. My read of the economics is this: repairability is a luxury of margin. Western chip firms designing socketed, serviceable parts could absorb the cost of modularity because their margins allowed it. Chinese embedded controller designers squeezed below $2 had no such room. Extreme integration was not a preference. It was the only competitive move available inside the box the restriction built. I want to be honest about what I'm not certain of. The causal chain from export controls to this specific design philosophy is my inference, not a documented policy outcome. The timeline fits, the economics fit. But I have not seen a Chinese chip designer state this publicly, and that gap matters. Which means the three strongest counterarguments deserve direct handling. First, integration density in embedded controllers has been a global trend for years, driven by bill of materials pressure everywhere, not uniquely by Chinese policy conditions. That is the hardest objection to dismiss, and it is fair. Second, no independent benchmark has confirmed that Chinese chip design philosophy diverges meaningfully from equivalent tier parts made by comparable Western manufacturers at the same price point. The villain in this story may be the price tier, not the geography. Third, physical limits are real. Thermal density in co-integrated power and logic designs, yield sensitivity at older fabrication nodes, and long-term reliability data all represent engineering constraints that cap how far this strategy can extend into demanding applications. Weighed together, the repairability crisis is real and worsening. The low-cost embedded controller sector is a major driver of it. But the export control thesis as a cause, rather than a coincidence, is my argument, not a documented chain of evidence. The crisis would be worth covering even if geopolitics had nothing to do with it. The geopolitical layer makes it more unsettling, not more proven, because it does not need to be intentional to be effective. That is the largest strategic reframe, and it has been almost entirely invisible in policy conversations about chips. The public debate about China's chip challenges focuses almost exclusively on the high end. Artificial intelligence accelerators, advanced logic, extreme ultraviolet lithography. The low-end embedded controller market, where reports suggest billions of units ship annually across consumer electronics, automotive, and industrial categories, has received almost no strategic attention from Western policymakers. That is where the volume lives. That is where the installed base is built. The right to repair movement has won genuine legislative progress in several jurisdictions. It was designed for a world where replacement parts exist and are accessible at serviceable margins. It has no mechanism for a supply chain where the replacement chip is unavailable to independent shops, cannot authenticate without factory tooling, and was never intended to be swapped in the first place, because the economics of the market that produced it made repairability an unaffordable feature from the start. The eviction notice was not addressed to your device. It was addressed to your repair shop, your right to repair law, and your assumption that the part would always be gettable. I think the restriction failed at its stated goal and succeeded at an unintended one. It did not slow China's low-end chip industry. It forced that industry into an integration model that now sets the discard rate for devices used by hundreds of millions of people who have never heard of an export control regulation in their lives. The wall became the map. But this map leads somewhere the policymakers were not looking, not toward advanced logic dominance, but toward a global installed base of devices that cannot be fixed because the smallest part inside them was optimized for a market shaped by the restriction. One $2 chip fails. The device receives an eviction notice. The building empties. And somewhere in Shenzhen, that outcome was not a flaw in the design. It was the only design the economics allowed. The most consequential chip in your laptop was never the one on the box. Have you ever had a device written off over a component that should have been a straightforward fix? Drop the part name and the quote you received in the comments. I want to see how deep this goes. If this kind of inside the supply chain analysis is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel covers the layer below the headline every time.